I wanna be a producer with a hit show on Broadway. I wanna be a producer.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Producer's Perspective podcast. I am Ken Davenport. This is the 24th episode of the podcast, believe it or not, already 24 down. And today I have quite a guest with me. First of all, I'm sitting in his apartment, which has a glorious view of the park. I'd have you all over, but I think John would look so good on crowding his living room here. But this man is responsible for helping to literally write the legal framework for the modern Broadway era. He has been called one of the most influential and powerful, and I've also heard one of the nicest attorneys in the biz. Welcome, John Breglio.
Hi, Ken. Nice to be here.
In addition to working with producers and theater owners both on and off Broadway, John has also repped hundreds of individual artists in the business, including a few bold-faced names like, Stephen Sondheim, Andrew Lloyd Webber, August Wilson, Michael Bennett, Marvin Hamlisch, and so on and so forth. I mean, just think about it. Can you imagine what a day in his office might be like? John, I have Andrew Lloyd Webber on 1 and Stephen Sondheim on 2. One of my questions for him will be a little later. Which call would you take? We'll get to that. In addition to his legal work, John is also quite a producer in his own right, stepping over to the dark side for the first time as the producer of the very successful first revival of A Chorus Line in 2006. Along the way, he has been the chair of TDF, the Theater Development Fund, and also advised all sorts of important nonprofits like New York Shakespeare Festival, the Actors Fund, Manhattan Theater Club Roundabout, and so on and so forth. John, how did your mega career in theater law get started? Where did this all begin for you?
Well, not to bore you with too much biography, but I always loved the arts. I studied piano for about 10 years, thought I was going to go to Juilliard, did not, went to Yale, got involved in theater. And that's what I thought I would always do. I would be doing theater in some form, musical theater or straight plays. But I had no choice because it was Vietnam. And the Vietnam War intervened. Most of my friends were either leaving the country or burning draft cards. It was a terrible period. By some stroke of luck, I got what was called a 1Y, which meant you would not get called up unless there was a national emergency. It was a new classification, so I found myself suddenly not drafted and able to pursue something else. So not knowing what else to do, which is what a lot of people did in the late 60s, I went to law school. And to my surprise, I really loved it. And then the second year of my law school career, I saw in the New York Times, second section, a huge piece on entertainment lawyers. And the lawyer they profiled was John Wharton, who was the dean of entertainment lawyers, particularly in theater and film. And he was one of the founding partners of my law firm, Paul, Weiss, Phipp, and Wharton and Garrison. So this was a revelation to me. I had no idea this existed, entertainment lawyers. And it was very different. You got to keep in mind, 68, this was now 70. It's not like today where entertainment lawyers are known generally. There weren't very many of them. And so I pursued that. I went to Paul Weiss as a summer associate, and that was it. I decided, well, this is perfect. I can combine what will be my avocational interests, presumably in the theater and the arts, with a career where I can make some money. So that's what I did. I went to Paul Weiss, extraordinary place where they had the dean of, entertainment lawyers, John Wharton, others, Bob Montgomery, who was one of the most well-known film lawyers. And I learned the theater business, the film business, the book publishing business, the music business. I mean, we represented ASCAP, we represented Frank Lesser, Cole Porter. I mean, I got an education that was staggering for me, especially someone who loved the arts. And that's how I got my education. And so I stayed, as you probably know, I stayed there until 2006, 7, more or less. And that's when I decided to go into producing full time. I no longer practice law, and I've been producing now for the past, 7 or 8 years. But without those 36 years of education, I could never do what I'm doing today. And all those years that I practiced, that's what I did. I mean, I represented producers. It's no secret. I'm sure your listeners and other people you've had on have said that there are many, many people in this business who are producers who are total neophytes. They've never produced before. They've made a ton of money in other parts of the world in whatever they've done. And then they, with a lot of extra money, want to come in and produce on Broadway. And they often hire entertainment lawyers to help them do it. So I was really doing producing, at least from the ground up, so much of the time. And then learning also, working with people like Michael Bennett and, and Hal Prince and these great writers like Stephen Sondheim and Joe Papp as an entrepreneur. I had a first-hand glimpse of what it was really like to be in the trenches. And they would come to me with their problems, which were business legal, but then I had an inside view of what it was like to be what they were. And so I was always itching to do it myself, and that's when I finally did do it. That's a long-winded answer. I don't know if I talk too much, but
not at all.
My background, sort of in a nutshell.
So, do you remember your first, when you started as a summer associate, as an associate there, what your first project was?
Oh yeah, are you kidding? It's a great one. I sat down at my desk and summer associate. And I got a call from one of the partners, and he said, "Come down, we're going to work on a new show." And he said, "Have you ever heard of Gone with the Wind?" And I burst out laughing. I said, "Yes." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "It's going to do a musical based on Gone with the Wind." So for me, I mean, you got to understand, this is this young kid, 20-something odd years old, besotted with, theater and everything else, having sat through law school for 3 years, and now suddenly my first time I was going to work on the Gone with the Wind, the musical. So I was absolutely beside myself. We were going to represent Stevens Mitchell, who was Margaret Mitchell's, I think it was her cousin. Anyway, he was quite elderly. And since we represented basic rights, the first thing was, do we want to have a show, a stage musical based on this incredible book? And the next thing I knew, I was on a plane with the partner, flying down to Atlanta, going down to this plantation-type country club in Atlanta, and there was Stevens Mitchell, all dressed in a white suit, Panama hat. It's really right out of the book. And we talked about doing the musical, the pros and cons of what it would be like, and what controls we could have, whatever, that kind of thing. And I was there representing, with the partner, of course. I was just an assistant representing Gone with the Wind. And we were off and running, and I was the lawyer, and I was given enormous responsibility. I was this green, not knowing anything lawyer, but Paul Weiss was that kind of place. They really threw you into the pit, and it was a great experience.
And just flashing forward towards the end of your career as a practicing attorney,
right.
Do you think it has become harder to make deals today, longer to make deals, to get them done? I love this story about everyone, including the writers in the room, trying to figure all this out, which doesn't happen today. Yeah. Today, we have phone calls that don't get returned for probably 3 or 4 weeks sometimes.
It's a very good question, because I have a span of, 40 years. Well, the one big change that has speeded things up, which is huge, is word processing. When I started practicing law, the only technological thing you had was a Xerox, we called a Xerox machine, a photocopier. There was nothing. There were no computers. There was no. Secretaries worked on typewriters with carbon copy. So if you had a 50-page agreement, or even a 30 or 20 or 10-page agreement, every change had to be made by hand and had to be either erased with what they called whiteout. I don't know if your listeners even know what whiteout is. And then all the pages had to be changed. It took forever to do a contract. Today, obviously, you take your laptop. The lawyers at Paul Weiss now don't even need secretaries, because they draft all their contracts themselves, and it's all done by computer. So they draft a contract, but they don't type it themselves. So in terms of speed of just getting the work out, the paperwork out, there's no comparison to the old days. But the other side of the coin is just pure negotiating, the process of talking to people, negotiating the deal. I think that has slowed down, and it's better now, but hasn't been great for several years is the complexity of royalty pools and amortization and the ignorance on behalf of so many people. And I don't use ignorance in a pejorative sense, just not knowing what these things are. And general managers and producers who are smart about it manipulating all the numbers and making the numbers for their benefit, and then showing these formulae and other things to agents and others who are mystified by it. They don't understand it. They need to use their lawyers and other people to figure it out. So that has made the negotiation on financial terms much more complicated and time-consuming. Most of the negotiations tend to be over that because things such as credit and per diem and the grant of rights, all those things that are critical to getting the rights and doing deals with orchestrators and directors, the basic terms haven't changed much in 40 years. They really haven't. And those are fairly straightforward. What is mostly consuming today are the financial terms. And as I said, in the old days, it was, are you going to give somebody a $5,000 advance? Or $6,000 or $7,000, and you're going to give them 2% of the gross or 3% of the gross. That doesn't take a long time to negotiate. Today, it could take weeks for people to not only understand it, but to figure out what they're going to settle for. So the financial rigmarole and the financial permutations today are so much more complicated than before, and that has led, I think, to a lot of delay in getting deals done.
What I find so fascinating about your career and who you've represented is you talk about representing the producers on a major Broadway musical. And then, of course, you've represented some of the greatest artists that the Broadway community has ever birthed. So you've repped both sides of it. Do you think that has helped you gain a greater understanding, obviously, of both sets of shoes and allow you to negotiate better? Because agents who represent artists only pitch one way, but you've pitched both sides.
I think it's been a great advantage to me because I am sympathetic to both sides. I'm almost more sympathetic to the artist, I think, because my wife is a writer. And also, I mean, it's the craft, it's the art from the writer side. And so many writers are so dependent on a lawyer or an agent for knowledge. A producer, if he knows anything, should be a little more sophisticated about what it means to pay operating profits as opposed to gross. But for writers who spend most of their time worrying about what's on the page, they don't even want to spend a lot of time worrying about that. So I think it's been, for me, a great benefit, but a joy to be able to be looking at it that way because it helps in any negotiation. So in a way, you can predict what you're going to get coming back. I mean, there's no point, if you're representing the producer, to go forward with a proposal, which before you even submit it, the other side, if they have any kind of decent representation, the writers are going to come back and say, no, I can't do this, I can do that. So you at least should start with something that you think is doable. The biggest problem for me is when I'm working on a deal where you have people on the other side, for example, West Coast people, who have no idea about the theater. Whether it's the studios, for example. First it was Disney, and then it was Warner, and then Paramount, and they started getting involved. And again, because I had that expertise, and I had film background too, I'd done a lot of film work, I represented most of them. And you can't imagine how complicated that was, because they had no idea of the culture of theater deals, where the writer owns the copyright. Well, in Hollywood, are you kidding? A writer owns nothing, right? So for them to think that they were going to do shows where the director owned the direction, choreographer owned the choreography, the book writer owned the book, and they just, until this day, by the way, they still can't believe the way we operate in the theater. So working with people who don't have any idea of really what they're doing on another side is the ultimate, it's a roadblock, and many deals are never made. So yes, for me to have understood both sides, and particularly when I was representing studios, which is like a third side, because they as far as they knew, they were going to come in and own everything, including Disney. And Disney was stunned when they started. This is not going to work for us. Beauty and the Beast, you know.
Do you think, I often theorize about whether someone coming in, and you're a great person to ask this, so you represent some authors, let's say, and they've written some stuff, but they never had massive hits in any way, and you're representing them, and a producer calls you and says, look, I want to option this piece, but we're going to do it a little differently. We're going to do it like the Hollywood model. I'm going to own it. I'm going to write them a big fat check to start with, and so they can write it and be very comfortable, but I'm going to own it from here on out. Would you entertain a deal like that?
Well, I would always pass it on to my client, because I think it's your obligation as a lawyer to always tell your client what the other side has offered, because that would be, I think it's unethical not to do it. It's just like a prosecutor, proposing a plea deal and not telling your client who's indicted what they could plead.
Would you recommend it?
But what I would do, I would sit down with the other side before I even went to my client and say to him, look, I'll do this. I'll tell my client this. But I've represented, I don't know, I can't even count how many people I've represented in my career. It's not going to happen. They won't accept it. Now, if he was making this proposal to some, I don't know, someone who's never written anything and had no credits and was just a first timer, I suppose they might take it. But in my career, it's never happened. Nobody has been willing to really take that kind of deal. They fight it because the peer pressure is enormous. Other writers who are older or more experienced, the Dramatist Guild comes down on them, even if it's not a Dramatist Guild. Their mentors say, you can't give away this. This is the birthright of being a dramatist. You've got to own your material. And I would sit down with them and say, look, if the thing that is produced ultimately is no good, well, okay, you will have gotten money up front and whatever and lost this. But if the show is really good, I said, you'll never make more money this way. You'll make so much more money down the road, and you'll own that copyright for the rest of your life, and your kids will benefit by it. Why are you giving away this birthright for? And it's difficult to tell people this if they really need the money. But I've never seen anybody really give away that much up front. They may offer $100,000 or so, $125,000. There was a studio once who offered someone $1 million. I remember that. And it was a very established person. And that was accepted. But even in that deal, they held back certain rights. But it almost never happens. They won't do it. And ultimately, the studio finds out that they're banging their head against more than one wall. They got the directors to deal with, they got the choreographers to deal with, they got the orchestra to deal with, the scenic designers. They all own their copyrights. And when they realize that that's the world they live in, they deal with it.
Now, you've obviously negotiated some pretty big deals over your career. Any stand out? Any stand out as being unique or different, or something that you remember as being a watershed moment?
Well, I have to go back to Chorus Line when Michael Bennett for the first time did a workshop and decided to use actors to help create a piece. They became part of the authors of a piece. And how was the industry going to deal with that? And over a period of 2 years that evolved, and it changed the course of musical theater. And nothing has come close to that from a pure sense of artistic creation as well as business deals that had to reflect what was going on creatively. So being more specific, I think most people know a Chorus Line started with a bunch of dancers getting into a room and Michael turning on a tape recorder and recording these interviews, just sitting around and just talking about their lives. And based on those interviews, Michael, after the interviews, decided that it might be a musical. And out of that came his hiring Marvin Hamlish, Ed Kleban for lyrics, Nicholas Dante, who was one of the dancers, to write the book, and then eventually Jimmy Kirkwood. And they slowly developed this show from nothing. And it just like a seed in the ground, organically this thing just built and built and built over a year and a half based on 2 workshops. Remember, back in 1975, there was no such word as workshop in the theater. I mean, view of, a bunch of elves sitting around tapping on tables. What the hell is a workshop? It was Michael created with Joe Papp. He said to Joe, I need to experiment because I don't know what I have. So they got in this room and they just kept working and working and working. And then he brought in Robin Wagner for sets and Theron Musser for lighting and Theone Aldrich for costume. And they started thinking about what this should be. And Michael finally figured out, okay, we're in an audition room, bare stage, whatever. And they're going to tell their lives and we're going to create a musical out of that. So that took money and time. $100,000 in 1975 is like $1.5 million today that Joe Papp did not have. Joe believed in Michael. And out of that came this workshop process. And suddenly everybody, because of the hit of Chorus Line everyone knew that it took months and months and almost 2 years to develop. So when Michael's next show came about, which was Ballroom, we needed to come up with contracts now that reflected all this because we had no contracts before, except we had a piece of paper that Michael had all the dances signed that said he owned everything for $1. In retrospect, Michael then, when Chorus Line was a big success, gave them a piece of his royalties and his subsidiaries. But now we had to codify that because Actors Equity said to us, we're not going to let you do another show like Chorus Line using all these actors and dancers and paying them $100 a week unless we have a deal. So literally, they pulled all the actors from the Thursday before we were going to start rehearsals. And Alan Grody, who's the lawyer down there, executive director for Equity, called me up and said, we're not going to let anybody go. We've got to have this put in writing. So I told Michael, and he said, well, just figure it out. I went over to see Bernie Jacobs, who was the head of the Schuberts and the single most powerful man in the theater, and Bernie Jacobs, Alan Grody, and I, literally for 24 hours around the clock, we never left the room, drafted the first workshop agreement. It gave the producer the right and the director to use actors for a reduced fee in a rehearsal room, use all their ideas, own all their ideas, but gave them a specific piece of the gross and a specific piece of the subsidiary rights. So the reason I say that was so revolutionary is that not only did that now become the template, which, by the way, is still used, the same document that we did in 1975 no, that was 77, in Bernie Jacobs' office. It's the same thing that's used today for workshops. Everybody then used workshops, and it did more than just change the relationship between actors and everybody in the room and directors. It suddenly changed the way people raised financing. Because now when you did a workshop, people no longer were doing only what Michael did, which was to just see if he had a show. Michael never invited investors to these things. He would never let that happen. Now suddenly producers will say, oh, well, now I'll do a presentation in workshop, and I'll invite all my investors. They don't just have to read a script and listen to a tape. Now they can actually see the show. That, of course, caused a lot of problems. It still causes problems. So that, to me, I think was a sea change like nothing else we've ever had, which today still affects artistically, creatively, marketing, everything.
You should get a royalty for writing that agreement, if only.
You're right. You know what? I never thought of that.
A bunch of lawyers are listening right now.
I would have had to share it with Alan Grody and Bernie Jacobs, though.
Speaking of Michael, obviously the world lost Michael way too early. If he were alive today, what do you think he would think of the current state of Broadway? Because you were very close.
I think of that all the time, what Michael would have done today. He's been dead 28 years. Because he'd only be, today, if he were alive, he'd be 73, 74. I mean, that's not old. Yeah, I mean, how old is Hal Prince? George Abbott, when he died, was 100, I think. Michael, God knows what would he have done. Now, but you asked a different question. What would he think of what was going on today? But I may be giving Michael too much credit here because I'm totally biased. But I don't think what's going on today would be going on today the same way. because Michael, remember, everything Michael did pushed the business farther along. I mean, Chorus Line was earth-shattering, and so was Dreamgirls. And so I know that he would never have done... I mean, he was going to do the Children's Crusade before he died. I mean, this was the way Michael thought. He thought in terms of just what nobody had ever done. So I think that the theater would be different today because of some of the advancements Michael would have made and some of the ideas he would have had. I don't want to overstate that, but I think that because there was a real fallow period there when, because of AIDS, which Michael died of, we were losing people like crazy. And so in came the British invasion right before Michael died. And that's that whole period where there was no invention by American musicals. Invention meaning the kind of invention we had with Chorus Line and Dreamgirls or other shows. It became the British invention. Well, that wasn't really an invention. It was like operetta. I mean, in many ways, if you look at it, again, I'm not trying to say this in a negative sense. It was sort of a step back because it was almost opera. And, Phantom of the Opera, Les Mis, and the second, there was sung-through pieces. The big change besides that was that they were monumental physical productions, where Michael Bennett created shows that were bare. They weren't cheap, but they looked very cheap. But here, these monumental shows came in, How long did it take to redo the Winter Garden Theater for Cats? And then Chandeliers coming down and the Majestic and Miss Saigon having It was a whole new focus on what appeared to be an appetite that the British created in the audience for big spectacles. That wasn't Michael's way of producing theater. So what he would have done in the middle of that, I don't know. I know what he thought of it. He thought this is not what I do. I know that. I mean, it wasn't. So, right before he died, of course, he dropped out of chess. And chess was going to be, again, a bare stage with a circular turntable that tilted, and the whole wall in the back were nothing but video monitors. And we're talking about 1985. Nobody ever did anything like that before. So, again, it would have been very bare. It was unbelievably expensive. What do you want to do? So that was the way Michael created his magic, and it was very different from the Brits. And then after that, what can I say? I mean, we've had a lot of musicals that sort of comment on musicals, laugh about musicals, reflect on what musicals are, but we now have, I think, a lot of very talented people. They've emerged after a generation that we lost, who are in their own strides, the Casey Nicholaus, the Susan Stroman. They're all, great directors who are going to find their own ways. But I know Michael would not have changed if he was alive today. He would continue to want to do things that were not literal on stage physically. He believed in movement, choreography, lighting, and the basic material to run a show. He never believed that hard scenery added anything other than unnecessary sort of distractions.
And now you're producing as well. In 2006, it was a Chorus Line, obviously, the Michael Bennett piece. Tell me about what that was like for you now being on that side of the table for sure. Obviously, you'd been doing lots of things with Michael over the years, but now this was you. Did you find yourself enjoying it at first? Was it? Yeah,
I mean, I did Chorus Line again all over the world. I did Dreamgirls here. I did that all over the world. I was involved with Lisa Strati Jones. I've been involved in several other shows, and what I learned was remarkable because I went in thinking that I had a lot of knowledge, and I'd watched other people. So many people. And the thing I realized more than anything before I started was that I had learned more from people who had not succeeded than the people who had succeeded. It's very hard to actually duplicate success and watch someone say, God, why are they so successful? Because it's sort of so many intangibles. But when you see someone not succeed, you can usually identify what their issues are. And so it was helpful to see that because you want to stay away from what those people did easily. And that was a big education for me, knowing how you made mistakes. But I had no idea until I started. I had no idea how much I still needed to learn, because it is a big, big job. And it's not a big job if all you really think you have to do is write a check and sit back and have your general manager do it, which is, I suppose you could do, but then your general manager is basically producing it. But if you believe you have to be involved with the creative people, you have to be working with them, you have to be the one responsible for raising the money, you have to be the person who understands all the deals, and then not only do all that and then get to, auditions and get to rehearsals and get to previews, and then afterwards, the amount of work that's involved became a surprise to me of managing a hit. How you have to, it's a daily job if you do it right. And so it became for me an all-consuming job, because I really wanted to do as much as I could and learn all the things I never had done before. So I had still a big education to go through, but I loved it. I mean, I just loved it because I do think I had such a foundation to start with that it wasn't as if I was starting from day one, which is what's a box office.
Well, it's an incredible testament to your character to be able, with someone as much experience as you have, to be able to go, oh, I've still got a lot to learn. It's a tough business if you really understand how much you need to know. I mean, that's why one of the reasons I wrote this book, I think I told you about, which I just finished, because I realized how complicated it is to really produce. I can't tell you how many people, I'm sure you've had this, at cocktail parties or wherever, friends you meet for the first time, they say, well, what does a producer do? Yeah, and everybody has a different view. Someone has a view that all you do is raise money, right? Other people think, well, you go to casting sessions. Is that what you do? They think you're Max Bialystock. And then other people don't have any idea what a producer does. They just sort of think it all happens. And, the writer writes it and the director directs it. And what do you do? And I know there are so many people out there who will be great producers. And I thought this book, which really goes into great depth between the day you have the idea, literally the idea, that's all you have, yourself and the idea in the shower, to opening night. And I wanted to show the full panoply of things: artistic, business, marketing, financial, legal, the whole thing that you really need to understand, at least to the extent I can paint some kind of picture in this book, because it's not a simple task, as you well know. When's this book coming out?
I can't be sure yet, because I still have to start all the conversations with my editor and all that stuff that goes on. I would guess sometime in 2016.
You have a title yet?
Working title is called Behind the Curtain, and if you want, I'll tell you a little reason why. Part of the reason is for the obvious thing is behind the curtain, what goes on backstage, and how a show's put together. But and this is a cute little story. When I was a very young boy, and I was sort of fascinated with the theater. I'm talking 7 or 8 years old. I didn't know that much about theater. I was raised as a Catholic, and the church for me was an incredible theatrical event. I didn't realize it then, but that's what really attracted me to the mass. You had bells and whistles, and you had smoke, and you had lights and all this stuff, and I just loved the whole scene, right? I didn't realize that what I would loved was the theatricality of it. So when at a very early age, my mother would talk about hearing a little bell or something going on in the living room, and just like these curtains, which your listeners can't see, I would draw these curtains and stand behind the curtain, and I would act like I was in church. And it wasn't that I wanted to be a priest. It was for me. I was acting. And she had no idea what was going on. But I realized that was my first sense of what drama could be like, or theatricality. So when I decided on the title, and I tell some of these stories in the beginning of my book, I decided Behind the Curtain made a lot of sense.
So that means that the Pope is one of the greatest producers of live entertainment on the planet.
Have you ever seen anything more incredible than Christmas Eve Mass?
Before I get to my final question, I have one penultimate question, which is Dreamgirls Broadway revival.
Yeah.
What do we think? Gonna happen?
Well, I did revive it until 2009. And I opened it at the Apollo Theater here, and I toured it all over the country. Right now, we're focusing on London. It's going to be done in the West End, 2016. Casey Nicholaw is going to direct. A totally new production. So that's the focus right now. So if that's, with Casey Nicholaw, who seems to be batting 1,000, we'll see what he does with it. If that's a big success over there, that's the one we'll bring here. If it's not successful, we'll see. But we're waiting now. We're not going to do anything with Broadway until we see what we have in the West End. It's never been done in the West End. So Never done. No one could figure out how to do it there. It was too expensive. So I don't know how, I'm working with Sonia Friedman, I don't know how it's going to get financed, how the budget's going to be. Because, it's an incredibly expensive show.
I have a feeling a lot of my listeners are on Expedia right now looking at flights to get over there and see what I'm sure will be a monumental production. Okay, last question. I want you to imagine that the genie from Aladdin comes up to your apartment. First of all, says, great view. Second of all, says, John, you've had an incredible career and you have stood up for these incredible artists and helped create these incredible agreements like the workshop. You've done such great work on Broadway. I want to grant you a wish. What is the one thing, John, that drives you so crazy about Broadway, that keeps you up at night, that you still get angry even after all the success, that you would want this genie with the snap of a finger to change and make disappear?
Anything
about it. I've had everything from sippy cups to expensive theater tickets. What's that one burning thing that drives you nuts?
The education of the audience. I would love to go back to a time, and I'm not looking back saying, in the old days, today, where we had an audience that had been trained and learned about the great works of the theater and could appreciate what great theater is. I worry all the time about the dumbing down of our audiences, the lack of education in schools about what great art is. All art is, not only theater. They don't know what the great shows were, what the great... there's no follow-through. And the everything from despicable way people dress when they go to the theater, the idea that you can sit next to someone who has flippy flops, it has, flops on not even a t-shirt, what is those underwear shirts that have, straps, and Bermuda shorts, and is drinking and eating next to you. The idea that that's permitted and that's what we're having in the theater now is an abomination. Theater is an event. It's a communal event. It's something that you can only do the live experience. It's not sitting home looking at a screen and having Cheetos. It's sitting in a theater where you have a communal event with people, where you share something wonderful on stage that's live, that's thrilling, that you have to have, and it's respect for the actors. Can you imagine what it's like? And I know actors have told me this, when they look out in that audience and they see what is basically a baseball field, a baseball bleachers. It's degrading, and that's just appearances. I understand, but it's more than appearances, because so many of these people have no sense of theater, and it goes so deeply into it. Because when I saw Al Pacino, I'll never forget, in Merchant of Venice, and I sat in front of a bunch of young women who went to see it, and clearly they only were there because of Al Pacino. But that's so sad that we don't have an educated, knowledgeable audience. I mean, when we were at TDF, I did with Wendy Wasserstein this program where every year we bring in a lot of kids, and we have mentors. actors and directors and take them to the theater. And these are kids that are really all come from the inner city. They've never been to the theater, and I really felt that we needed to expose these kids to something more than what they're being exposed to now. So it starts from the ground up. Our schools don't do it. We haven't had a president really since Kennedy who really cares about the theater. We have a mayor who doesn't even know where the theaters are. It's not on anybody's list of what's important. And I may be talking totally right, but you said to me, what's my wish? My wish is that we could start now, and maybe 20 years from now, we'll have people who have appreciation for how important the theater is and how much a part of their lives it could be, as opposed to just another event. It really should be something that's much more special in people's lives, and they should know more about the history of what we did in this country. I mean, musical theater, for example, as opposed to theater generally, that was our art form. We created it, and how many young people understand all the different kinds of musical theater that you could be exposed to? I mean, one of the great things about Hamilton is that it exposes people to a different way of looking at musical theater, and more things like that would be great. But that to me is a great loss, and it's been during my lifetime. The difference between audiences and what way they react and the way they understood and appreciated theater has been lost. I mean, and now we've dumbed it down, and the kind of material we put on the stage hasn't helped to a large extent. So that's another story. That's my wish.
It's a good one. It's a great one, and spoken by a true lover of the theater, obviously. John, thank you so much for having me here and being a guest on the podcast. Thanks all of you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. We've got some very cool guests coming up. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.